Welcome to Abdullah the Ethiopian Mystic, the channel that uncovers hidden African spiritual knowledge and the lives of forgotten mentors who shaped modern metaphysics. Here, we explore history, oral traditions, and the stories behind influential teachers like Abdullah, the Ethiopian mystic remembered through Neville Goddard.
Today, we shall be talking about Ethiopia African spiritual symbolism. Purposely to explore the symbolic and historical significance of Ethiopia in African and global mysticism. You are welcome. Today, we journey not just to a place on the map, but to a spiritual axis of African and global consciousness. We journey to Ethiopia, a land mentioned in ancient scripture, celebrated in African oral tradition, respected in global mysticism, and remembered as a symbol of unbroken African sovereignty and sacred memory. This episode explores Ethiopia's spiritual history, its deep African symbolism, and why Ethiopia occupies a central place in African mysticism and the metaphysical imagination of the world. Pause. Breathe. And let us begin. Talking about Ethiopia more than a country. Ethiopia is not merely a modern nation-state. It is a symbolic civilization. In ancient times, Ethiopia was known as Kush or Ethiopia, a name used by Greek historians to describe lands of deep wisdom, dark-skinned peoples, and sacred knowledge. To many African spiritual traditions, Ethiopia represents origin, continuity, sacred antiquity, divine order. It is one of the few African civilizations that resisted colonization, preserving not only political independence, but spiritual memory. In African symbolism, Ethiopia stands as a reminder that Africa was never empty, never primitive, and never spiritually void. Also, Ethiopia in biblical and ancient texts. Ethiopia appears repeatedly in sacred texts. Psalm 68:31 declares, "Ethiopia shall soon stretch out her hands unto God." This verse is not merely prophetic. It is symbolic. In African mysticism, it speaks of Africa's spiritual authority and divine recognition. In the Book of Acts, we encounter the Ethiopian eunuch, a royal official, educated, wealthy, and spiritually curious. Not a passive recipient of faith, but a seeker of truth. This challenges colonial interpretations of Africa as spiritually empty. Ethiopia was already reading scripture when much of Europe was still forming kingdoms. Another perspective is the Solomonic dynasty's sacred kingship. One cannot discuss Ethiopia's spiritual symbolism without addressing the Solomonic dynasty. According to Ethiopian tradition, recorded in the Kebra Nagast, Ethiopian kings descended from King Solomon, Queen Makeda, Queen of Sheba. This lineage was not only political, it was sacred kingship. In African mysticism, kingship was never separate from spirituality. A king was not merely a ruler. He was a custodian of divine order. This idea deeply influenced Rastafarian theology, Pan-African spiritual consciousness, Black liberation spirituality. Ethiopia became a living symbol of African divine legitimacy. Now on Ethiopia African mysticism. African mysticism does not separate spirit from matter. Ethiopia exemplifies this unity. Its ancient Christian tradition, with roots older than many European churches, blends fasting, chanting, sacred geometry, symbolic ritual, earth, spirit alignment. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserves texts, chants, and cosmologies that resonate deeply with broader African spiritual systems. In African symbolism, Ethiopia represents the spiritual spine of Africa, a bridge between ancient wisdom and modern faith. A reminder that African spirituality is structured, philosophical, and profound. How would you describe Ethiopia in global spiritual consciousness? Ethiopia's symbolism traveled far beyond Africa. For the African diaspora, especially during enslavement, Ethiopia became a symbol of hope. Spirituals, sermons, and liberation theology invoked Ethiopia as a land of dignity, redemption, and divine promise. In Rastafarian thought, Ethiopia is Zion, the spiritual homeland, a symbol of black divine identity. Even beyond Africa, Ethiopia influenced esoteric Christianity, African-centered metaphysics, global mystical interpretations of scripture. Ethiopia's spiritual history became a counter-narrative to racial and spiritual inferiority myths. Would you compare symbolism vs geography? It is important to understand this clearly. Ethiopia is both a place and a symbol. In African mysticism, symbolism does not deny reality. It deepens it. Ethiopia symbolizes continuity of African spirit, resistance to spiritual erasure, memory of sacred origin. To speak of Ethiopia spiritually is to speak of Africa remembering itself. In closing reflection, as we conclude, remember this: Ethiopia's power is not nostalgia. It is meaning. It reminds the world that African spirituality is ancient, disciplined, and globally influential. To study Ethiopia's spiritual history is to reclaim African symbolism from silence and distortion. This is not romanticism. Let me thank you for joining this journey into Ethiopia and African mysticism. If this message resonated with you, like, subscribe, and share. In our next episode, we continue exploring African spiritual consciousness and its relevance for today. Until then, walk in wisdom, honor memory, and stay spiritually grounded. May we seek truth with humility, walk in faith with awareness, and honor our identity with dignity. May wisdom guide our thoughts, and peace dwell in our hearts with consciousness. Type consciousness in the comment section too, and I will add you to my favorite list for more of this. Thank you. This is Abdullah the Ethiopian.